In one early sutta, the Buddha discusses what we might term the three-stroke engine of practice, this engine, three-part engine that keeps us going in the right direction. It comes from an early, a somewhat obscure sutta, but a sutta that I love nonetheless, so I'll discuss that and this sutta in today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. What are the processes that lead us to progress down the path towards awakening? In one early sutta called the Great 40, which is a somewhat obscure sutta, but I think a fascinating one nonetheless, the Buddha tries to delve into some of the mechanisms here that keep us moving in the right direction. It's a sutta that has many different aspects. Another aspect of the sutta involves the distinction between mundane and transcendent aspects of the path, and that is a separate issue that I'll get to a little bit later on in this talk. But for now, what I want to do is to focus on this engine, this what we might call three-stroke engine here that keeps us moving in the right direction. Now, this sutta, the Great 40, is interesting as being one of the few places where right concentration, which is the 8th step on the Eightfold Path, the last step, right concentration is defined as a kind of a focused mind, a one-pointed mind that is supported by all of the other path factors, the other 7 path factors. It's unusual because usually in early Buddhism, right concentration is defined in terms of the 4 jhanas. Jhanas are states of meditative absorption in which we have certain kinds of feelings that arise naturally within us, pleasant feelings of various kinds. So this is unusual in this case. However, what the Buddha says here is that in all of these cases, he says right view comes first. Right view, that is the first of the 8 steps on the Eightfold Path, it comes first not simply in being the first step, but in literally being at the head of everything. We can think of this in conceptual terms, that it's knowing right from wrong that keeps us going in the right direction, that keeps us from falling off the path to one side or the other. Now, at our stage in the path where we're relative beginners, or even pretty far along, we should understand this as conceptual in early Buddhism. That is, it's knowing the concepts of right versus wrong, of knowing that there is a difference between right and wrong. That is to say, part of right view that is the first stage on this journey, this thing that comes first, part of this is overcoming our ordinary cynicism about right and wrong, our ordinary relativism about right and wrong. These senses that we have that, maybe there isn't really any difference between doing right and doing wrong. That's the kind of opinion that can really get us sidetracked or off track completely. And so it's overcoming those ordinary tendencies that's part of this beginning stage, this conceptual beginning stage along the path. And then what right view helps us with is investigating the other elements of the path. In particular, the Buddha says here, investigating right intention, whether we have the right or wrong intentions, our right actions, our right speech, our right livelihood, investigating all of these and seeing right versus wrong, seeing that there is a better way to do things, a way that is more skillful, more healthy for us and for other people, and that there are other ways that are less skillful and healthy for us and for everybody else. It's seeing these differences in all of these different aspects of the Eightfold Path that keeps us moving in the right direction. But in all of these cases, just seeing and understanding this difference between right and wrong isn't alone enough. It's not enough simply to know or see this difference. We have to engage effort. We have to engage effort to abandon the wrong in all of these and to foster the right in all of these. So we have to make effort to, let's say, abandon wrong speech or wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong intention, and to foster our ordinary tendencies towards kindness and compassion, let's say with intention or with our speech, with our actions, with whatever livelihood we pick. It's effort together with right view that keeps us going, that actually keeps us going, I should say. I mean, the view itself doesn't, in a sense, go anywhere. The view is just a view. Until it engages with effort, it's idle. But even that's not enough. We also need the element of mindfulness. I think we all know that you can make effort even with right view, even knowing what you should be doing, and you can make a certain kind of effort, but if the effort is not done mindfully, it can misfire. I think we all know of examples where we know what the right thing to do is, where we're making a certain kind of effort, but we're not really engaging with the world mindfully. We're not really fully engaged. And in that kind of circumstance, a right effort can go wrong. We can step off on the wrong foot. And also in that kind of circumstance, we may not be making appropriate effort at all. So what we need is a mindful approach to life in all of its circumstances. What the Buddha says in this Sutta on the Great 40 is that these three path factors are essentially, in a certain way of looking at it, the most important. They're the ones that the Buddha says revolve around all of the other path factors. You can think of it, or I think of it, as kind of, again, a three-stroke engine that sort of continues moving forward. They revolve around, they move around the other path factors. Right view, right effort, right mindfulness. Right view, keeping us going in the right direction. Right effort, keeping us actually moving. And right mindfulness, keeping the mind engaged so that we are acting in an appropriate way given the circumstance. It's these three path factors engaged that helps us to put into practice right intention and right action and right livelihood and right speech and so on. This is this three-stroke engine that I say helps us progress in the right direction as we practice. Now there's another element of this sutta, which I mentioned, which has to do with the distinction between mundane and transcendent when it comes to path factors. In particular, in this sutta, in the Pali example, we find various of these path factors given both mundane and transcendent interpretations. That is to say, there's mundane right view, transcendent right view, mundane intention, and action, speech, livelihood. There are a number of these that are given both. And the distinction given between mundane and transcendent is that the mundane path factors are, he says, defiled. They're defiled path factors. They ripen in attachment. They're done simply for doing, shall we say, getting good karma for ourselves. That you might say they're self-directed, they're selfish in a sense. They're based on getting benefits for ourselves in some sense. Whereas the transcendent path factors, he says, are undefiled. They ripen in awakening as opposed to attachment. Now the idea here basically is that the mundane path factors are path factors directed at the good. That is to say, they're path factors that include right view, so they're directed in the right direction, but they're defiled because they are directed towards benefits for ourselves. In other words, we're doing good in order to gain something out of it, let's say. That's an example. But precisely how to make this distinction here between mundane and transcendent is a little bit difficult. And there are some oddities with the presentation. For example, when the sutta makes the distinction between mundane and transcendent right view, for example, neither of these definitions that it discusses involve the Four Noble Truths, which is very strange because in most early Buddhist texts, or many early Buddhist texts, right view is defined in terms of the Four Noble Truths, a view of the first, second, third, and fourth Noble Truth. Understanding or seeing that life is unsatisfactory, and that unsatisfactory nature of life is due to our attachments, and that there is an end to attachments, and that end is through the Eightfold Path. That is sort of the understanding of right view that we get most of the time. We don't find that in this particular sutta. And similarly, with many of the other path factors, the mundane path factor, such as, let's say, mundane right speech, or mundane right action, mundane right intention, these are given, the definition of the mundane one uses the same words that we find the path factor itself defined in other texts. Why is that strange? Well, it's strange because here they say that mundane path factor culminates in attachment. It ripens in attachment. Whereas in other texts, that same definition ripens in awakening. That is to say, the path factor itself is the one that leads us to awakening, except in this text it doesn't. In this text you need something more. So this is very strange. And the question is what to make of that. And here is where a deep historical study and textual comparisons of parallel recensions in other languages can be immensely helpful. One of the people studying this most deeply is the scholar of early Buddhism, Analyo, and he has looked, and others have looked at the recensions of this particular text as we find it in the Chinese example and in the Tibetan example. And in those examples, we don't have any mention of this distinction between mundane and transcendent in these path factors. In other words, there are a number of different mentions of mundane and transcendent in this text, in the Pali text, that we just don't find in other examples that have been translated into other languages. So the conclusion that Analyo takes, and others as well, is that this distinction between mundane and transcendent that we find in the Great 40 was probably a later addition. In other words, it wasn't originally there. It wouldn't perhaps have been there in the Buddha's lifetime. It would have been added, in particular, Analyo believes, it would have been added perhaps during the time of the rising of the Abhidhamma or Abhidharma. Now, the Abhidhamma is a later tradition within Buddhism. Each school had its Abhidharma, and that was a way of sort of collating and interpreting the early texts by trying to find the commonalities in all of them and put them into an organized and systematic kind of theory. And one of the things that happens when you try to do that is that you try to overcome problems, or at least potential problems, that you find in the original texts. And one of these problems or concerns was making out precisely the distinction between somebody approaching the path from, let's say, a beginner's perspective versus somebody who sees the path from a more awakened perspective. What is this awakening mind? What is this transcendent mind like? How does it differ from the more mundane mind that we ordinarily have? That is, I think many of us have struggled with, perhaps, the differences between, let's say, being on the Buddhist path and doing it for selfish reasons, to make ourselves better people, let's say, versus being on the Buddhist path in a kind of a selfless way. And we understand that the selfless way is perhaps more refined and farther along, but we aren't there yet, or at least we're not there often. And so within the later period of development of these theories, there was an attempt, or more of an attempt, or an interest, a concern about distinguishing these two. Distinguishing between people who were on the path, but, shall we say, not entirely on the path because they were doing things that weren't quite right, versus people who were really completely on the path. And as you make that out more and more and try to refine this more and more, it becomes that sort of your own, that the transcendent path becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until that transcendent path really is only momentary, if you like, at the end of the path to awakening, when awakening actually occurs. And then at that moment, or at that time, that small time period, then you all of a sudden are on this transcendent path. And it's almost like, as I've heard, I believe, Bhikkhu Bodhi describe, that the transcendent path is really not a path at all, it's only a moment. So these become very, shall we say, difficult and complicated things to contemplate. But that perhaps is one of the reasons why we find this element in this Sutta on the Great 40. I mean, if you're interested in looking at it, I'll put a link to it down below. I always put links to the suttas that I discuss in videos down below the video so that you can go and look at them if you want to. And one of the issues here is how it is that we can indeed pursue the path through, let's say, a comparing mind, by saying, which is ordinarily considered conceit. Conceit is a bad thing in Buddhism, comparing yourself to others, puffing yourself up, or putting yourself down. These are not considered particularly healthy, but if they're done on the service of the path, it can be, at least in certain contexts, a kind of a skillful means to get us along. And indeed, there are early suttas that discuss these very things, that there are certain kinds of what we might call normally unskillful mental states, or you might say mundane or defiled, if you want to use that term, mental states that are nevertheless useful to us along the path. And I actually did an earlier video discussing just this weird kind of paradoxical fact where I get into some of this. And I'll put a link to it up on the screen if you want to watch it. Thanks so much to my patrons over on Patreon. Join them if you want to help out, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll catch you on the next video.